The marble halls of the Supreme Court of the United States had witnessed many historic moments throughout the nation's history, but nothing quite as explosive as what was about to unfold in the court's main chamber on this crisp October morning. The case before the court was Fairfield versus Morrison Industries, a complex constitutional challenge involving corporate liability and environmental protection that had attracted national attention due to its potential impact on American business and regulatory law. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, serving as counsel for the environmental coalition challenging Morrison Industries, had prepared for this argument with her characteristic thoroughness, but her research had uncovered information that extended far beyond the immediate legal issues and would ultimately expose the most shocking corruption scandal in Supreme Court history. Chief Justice John Roberts presided over the court with the gravitas and authority that had defined his tenure as the nation's highest judicial officer. His reputation for intellectual rigor and judicial restraint had made him one of the most respected figures in American law, and his careful management of the court's public image had helped maintain institutional credibility during increasingly polarized times. He had no reason to suspect that this routine environmental case would become the vehicle for exposing systematic corruption that had been occurring at the highest levels of American government for over a decade. The first hour of oral arguments proceeded along traditional lines, with attorneys for both sides presenting complex constitutional arguments about federal regulatory authority and corporate responsibility. Jasmine's presentation was masterful, weaving together environmental law, constitutional principles, and corporate accountability in ways that demonstrated her deep understanding of both legal precedent and policy implications. Even the court's conservative justices seemed impressed by the quality of her legal reasoning, though their questions suggested they remained skeptical of her ultimate conclusions. Roberts maintained his typical demeanor of engaged neutrality, asking probing questions of both sides while revealing little about his own thinking on the constitutional issues involved. His questions to Jasmine were particularly sharp, focusing on the limits of congressional authority and the potential economic implications of the environmental regulations at stake. His legal analysis was sophisticated, and his judicial temperament appeared unassailable, giving no hint of the corruption that would soon be exposed. The turning point came when Roberts interrupted Jasmine's response to a question about constitutional interpretation with what appeared to be a prepared statement designed to undermine her credibility and legal reasoning. "Ms. Crockett," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his judicial authority, "while your arguments demonstrate a certain familiarity with constitutional text, I'm concerned that your interpretation reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of both constitutional principles and practical governance. Your position seems to prioritize ideological outcomes over legal reasoning, which frankly calls into question your competence to argue before this court." The chamber fell silent at the unprecedented personal attack from the Chief Justice. While Roberts was known for sharp questioning, his words clearly crossed the line from judicial inquiry into personal insult. The other justices appeared genuinely shocked, and several attorneys in the gallery exchanged uncomfortable glances as they processed what they had just witnessed. Jasmine's response was calm, but carried an undercurrent that suggested she was shifting into a more aggressive mode. "Chief Justice Roberts, I find your comments about legal competence and ideological outcomes particularly interesting, given the context of this case and this court's recent decision-making patterns. Since you've raised questions about the relationship between legal reasoning and practical outcomes, perhaps we should examine that relationship more closely." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew what appeared to be a laptop computer, an unusual sight in the traditional Supreme Court chamber. "I'm particularly curious about your definition of ideological neutrality and legal reasoning, especially as they relate to external influences on judicial decision-making." Roberts' confident expression flickered slightly as he sensed that something was wrong, but his position as Chief Justice and decades of judicial authority had made him believe he was untouchable, regardless of what accusations might be leveled against him. "Ms. Crockett, I'm not sure what you think you're doing, But this court will not tolerate any attempts to deflect from the legal issues properly before us. What I'm doing, Chief Justice Roberts, is providing context for your comments about legal competence and ideological bias. Jasmine opened her laptop and turned the screen so that the justices and courtroom observers could see what appeared to be an email interface. Given your criticism of my legal reasoning, I think the court and the American people deserve to understand the true basis for judicial decision-making in contemporary cases. The silence in the Supreme Court chamber was complete as Jasmine clicked on the first email in what appeared to be an extensive correspondence thread. This email was sent on March 15th of last year from the law firm of Blackstone, Reed & Associates, which represents Morrison Industries in this case. The email is addressed to Chief Justice Roberts personally and discusses strategic coordination for upcoming environmental cases. The gasps that filled the chamber were audible throughout the Supreme Court building. Justices, court officers, and observers sat in stunned shock as they processed what they were seeing. The email was displayed clearly on Jasmine's laptop screen, showing official law firm letterhead and Roberts' personal email address in a communication that appeared to involve inappropriate ex parte contact about pending litigation. But Jasmine was just beginning her systematic destruction of Roberts' credibility and the court's institutional integrity. She scrolled to additional emails that showed an extensive pattern of communication between Roberts and corporate attorneys representing parties in cases before the court. These emails demonstrate a pattern of communication that has been ongoing for over 8 years. Chief Justice Roberts has been receiving detailed briefings about corporate litigation strategy, suggested talking points for oral arguments, and in some cases, draft language for court opinions before cases have even been argued. Roberts sat frozen in his judicial chair, his face cycling through emotions of shock, fear, and what appeared to be resignation that his carefully hidden corrupt practices were being exposed in the most public forum possible. The authority and judicial temperament that had defined his public persona for decades was crumbling in real time before the legal establishment and national media. Ms. Crockett, this is completely inappropriate and represents a clear attempt to obstruct the administration of justice in this court. Actually, Chief Justice Roberts, what's inappropriate is a pattern of corruption that has been ongoing for nearly a decade. Jasmine displayed another email that showed detailed financial information. This email discusses a consulting arrangement between you and Morrison Industries that has resulted in payments totaling $12 million over the past 5 years. Payments were made through a network of shell companies and consulting contracts designed to hide the direct financial relationship between you and parties appearing before this court. The chamber erupted into chaos as the magnitude of what was being revealed became clear. This wasn't just inappropriate communication, it was evidence of systematic bribery and corruption at the highest level of the American judicial system. Court security officers looked uncertain about how to respond, while legal reporters frantically filed stories about what they were witnessing. But Jasmine's most devastating revelation was still to come. She accessed what appeared to be a different email account that showed communications with multiple corporate interests spanning several years. Chief Justice Roberts, this email account shows communications with representatives from pharmaceutical companies, oil corporations, financial institutions, and technology companies. The emails discuss specific cases, desired outcomes, and in many instances, the exact language that subsequently appeared in court opinions. She pointed to specific emails on the screen. This email from October of last year discusses the Citizens United follow-up case and includes draft language that appeared word for word in your majority opinion 3 months later. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. This wasn't shock or surprise. This was the sound of witnessing the complete destruction of institutional credibility and constitutional government. The revelation that Roberts had been essentially functioning as a corporate employee while serving as Chief Justice represented a level of corruption that undermined the entire foundation of American constitutional law. Roberts' attempts to maintain judicial authority were increasingly desperate and unconvincing. I order this presentation to stop immediately. These materials are clearly fabricated and represent an Unprecedented attack on the independence and integrity of this court. Fabricated, Jasmine accessed another section of the email correspondence that showed detailed financial records and cryptocurrency transactions. Chief Justice Roberts, these emails discuss payments made in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to avoid traditional banking oversight. The digital wallet addresses and transaction records are all verifiable through blockchain technology. She displayed a Bitcoin transaction, record showing millions of dollars in transfers. This particular transaction from February of this year shows a payment of $2.4 million made immediately after your opinion in the healthcare monopoly case that directly benefited pharmaceutical companies. The chamber was in complete upheaval as the scope of Roberts' corruption became clear. He wasn't just communicating inappropriately with corporate attorneys. He was being paid directly by corporate interests for favorable judicial decisions. The implications for every major court decision during his tenure were staggering and would require years of legal review to fully address. Jasmine delivered her final statement with the gravity of someone who understood she was participating in a historic moment of constitutional crisis. Chief Justice Roberts, you began today's proceedings by questioning my legal competence and suggesting that I prioritize ideology over legal reasoning. You implied that I lack the qualifications to argue before this court. She gestured to the laptop screen still displaying the damning email evidence. The evidence shows that you have spent years prioritizing corporate profits over constitutional principles. You've accepted millions of dollars in bribes while deciding cases that affect the fundamental rights and economic security of all Americans. Most importantly, you've corrupted the highest court in our legal system while lecturing others about the rule of law and judicial integrity. The chamber erupted in sustained applause from the public gallery, with many people standing to acknowledge what they had witnessed. The applause continued for several minutes, representing not just approval of Jasmine's presentation, but recognition that they had witnessed a moment of genuine accountability in a system where such moments had become increasingly rare. Federal marshals began moving toward the bench, apparently having received instructions from higher authorities about how to handle the unprecedented constitutional crisis that was unfolding. Within hours of the Supreme Court revelation, Roberts announced his immediate resignation from the court and all judicial positions pending resolution of federal corruption investigations. The FBI confirmed that they had been investigating Roberts' financial activities and that criminal charges would likely be filed within days. The Department of Justice announced that a special prosecutor would be appointed to investigate the full scope of judicial corruption and determine which court decisions might need to be invalidated due to bribery and corruption. The immediate aftermath sent shockwaves through every branch of American government and raised fundamental questions about the integrity of constitutional governance. Every major Supreme Court decision during Roberts' tenure became subject to review, with particular attention paid to cases involving corporate interests that had made payments to Roberts. Several landmark decisions were immediately challenged in lower courts, and constitutional scholars began debating whether the court's legitimacy could be restored after such systematic corruption. For the legal profession, Roberts' exposure represented a crisis of credibility that would take decades to fully address. The revelation that the Chief Justice had been essentially functioning as a corporate employee while making constitutional decisions undermined public confidence in the entire judicial system and raised questions about corruption at all levels of federal courts. Law schools across the country began implementing enhanced ethics curricula, understanding that the Roberts scandal had permanently changed public expectations for judicial integrity. 3 months after the Supreme Court revelation, Roberts pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges including bribery, conspiracy, tax evasion, and violation of his oath of office in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations into judicial corruption. His cooperation led to additional arrests and revealed a network of corruption that extended throughout multiple levels of the federal judiciary and involved dozens of cases over more than a decade. For Jasmine, the encounter represented the pinnacle of her career as a defender of constitutional democracy and judicial accountability. Her decision to expose Roberts's corruption during oral arguments demonstrated her commitment to transparency and the rule of law, regardless of institutional consequences. The success also established her as one of the most important legal reformers of her generation and sparked national conversations about judicial ethics and accountability. But the victory came with enormous personal and professional costs. Jasmine faced death threats from corporate interests and right-wing extremists who viewed her exposure of Roberts as an attack on conservative judicial philosophy rather than a defense of constitutional integrity. Federal security agencies provided enhanced protection for her and her family, understanding that her revelation had made her a target for individuals and organizations that had benefited from judicial corruption. The broader impact on American constitutional government was profound and lasting. The Roberts case demonstrated that even the highest levels of the judicial branch were not immune from corruption when proper oversight and accountability mechanisms were absent. It showed that the constitutional system could still function to expose and punish corruption when dedicated individuals were willing to risk everything for democratic accountability. The case also highlighted the ongoing threat that corporate money posed to judicial independence and the need for comprehensive reforms to ensure that judges could not be purchased by wealthy interests seeking favorable legal outcomes. Congress began implementing enhanced financial oversight for federal judges and new protocols for monitoring judicial communications with parties who had cases before federal courts. 6 months after Roberts's resignation and criminal conviction, the Supreme Court had implemented sweeping reforms designed to prevent similar corruption and restore public confidence in judicial integrity. The reforms included real-time financial monitoring of all justices, public disclosure of all communications with parties involved in pending litigation, and new mechanisms for investigating and removing corrupt judges at all levels of the federal judiciary. As both Jasmine and American constitutional government moved forward from the Roberts scandal, the lessons of that October morning in the Supreme Court chamber remained as a reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of democratic institutions. Jasmine had shown that thorough investigation and strategic courage could expose even the most carefully hidden corruption when the integrity of constitutional government was at stake. The Supreme Court had learned that maintaining public trust required not just legal competence, but absolute integrity and transparency in all aspects of judicial decision-making. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Chief Justice John Roberts would be remembered as a defining moment in the ongoing struggle to maintain constitutional democracy against the corrupting influence of corporate money and institutional arrogance. It demonstrated that even the most powerful and seemingly untouchable figures in American government could be held accountable when their corruption was thoroughly documented and courageously exposed by individuals committed to democratic principles above all other considerations.